What is up, people, and welcome back to a brand new video. And today we're going to be continuing my series of updating my 2026 election predictions, this time with the governor elections. Now, the governor of a state is extremely important. They can change a state legislatively by vetoing the legislature and pushing stuff through, since they're basically the president of that state, and they can seriously transform how a state trends politically over time. An example of that is Florida. When they elected Governor Ron DeSantis in 2018, they were more of a swing state. However, a lot of the things he implemented has seriously transformed Florida into the safe Republican state that we see today. So let's just get into it. We have 38 races to cover, most of which are going to happen in 2026, but two of which, Virginia and New Jersey, are going to happen in 2025. So let's just get started with the safe Democratic states, or the states that I think will be won by Democrats by over 15 points. Starting off with the state of California. This one shouldn't be much of a surprise here. It actually looks like Kamala Harris is going to run for this seat. I would be pretty surprised if she didn't. And if she did not, I would expect Katie Porter to win the primary. But either way, it is safe Democratic. Then we got Colorado. Michael Bennet is actually running for this, and I think he'll win the primary pretty easily and win the general election by around like 16 to 20 points. Then we got Hawaii. This one, it shouldn't be a shocker here. Then we got Maryland with Wes Moore. He's extremely popular in the state, and he might even have presidential ambitions for 2028. Then we got Massachusetts up there. Both of these, Maryland and Massachusetts, I think will be like D+30 or something. They're super Democratic states. And the final safe Democratic state is the state of Connecticut. It looks like the governor of Connecticut might have a primary challenger. I don't know how that primary is going to turn out, but either way, the general looks like it's going to be safe Democratic. And that's actually it. You might be like, well, why is there no Rhode Island or, no Vermont or stuff like that? But governor elections are super interesting because they are not as polarized. So you'll have a lot of these safer states not really being so safe and actually being way more competitive and more winnable for the other side. Now, for the Republican safe states, you've got the classic ones: Idaho, Wyoming, South Dakota. Nebraska could be under 15, but since it looks like Dan Osborne is going to run for Senate instead, I'm going to keep it at safe Republican. Then we got Arkansas, Tennessee, Alabama, and actually Vermont. Phil Scott is super beloved there. He's got like a 70% approval rating, the most popular governor in the entire country. I expect him to win every county by a massive margin. He's just extremely popular. If he were to retire, interestingly enough, I don't think Democrats would win it by that big of a margin, just because of how big the Republican Party still is in Vermont for the governor race and how big of a bench they have developed over the years. So I think it could even be likely Democratic, or it could still be safe. But it looks like Phil Scott's going to run for re-election anyway, so that doesn't really matter. Now, I know you're looking at this and being like, what's going on in Oklahoma? We'll get to that later. But first of all, for the likely Democratic states, or the races that I think will go to Democrats by between 15 and 5 points, starting off with the state of Oregon. Oregon has kind of a weird dynamic in their governor races, where they tend to be more Republican for governor races than they would be for, say, a Senate race or for president. This is mainly because they have actually tended to have pretty unpopular Democratic governors, including Tina Kotek, who is the current Democratic governor, who is one of the only governors in the entire nation who's underwater. But I still think she's going to win by a pretty solid margin of around 13 to 15 points. I do not expect it to be remotely as close as it was in 2022, unless something massive happens or Republicans nominate a very, very, very good candidate. Next, we got New Mexico. The Democratic frontrunner in the primary looks like it's going to be Deb Haaland, who is a great candidate, running a great campaign. She's already doing tours across the state, which is great to leave a mark on people, to show that you actually care, and she's polling very well. I expect her to win this race by around 12 to 13 points, which should be a big overperformance of the Senate race, which will be on the same ballot. Next, we got Minnesota. It looks like Tim Walz is going to run for re-election, but even if he doesn't, I expect it to be around the same margin. He's still pretty well liked, even after his failed presidential run, and I think he wins re-election here by around 9 points. If he does retire, I think it goes down to around 8 because there's no incumbency, but I still think it is likely D either way. Now, moving on to Illinois, J.B. Pritzker is running for re-election, and I expect him to win pretty easily by around 12 to 14. He won by 12 in 2022, so kind of balancing out the right-wing shifts of Illinois with the national environment, I expect him to win by a pretty similar margin, if not a bit to the left of that, by around, like I said, 12 to 14 points. Although much like we'll talk about for New York and New Jersey, I'm just going to get this out of the way now. I expect a lot of these more minority areas that are swinging to the right very fast to kind of be more tame in 2026 just because they are low propensity voters. So I expect these voters that are trending to the right more and more to vote less in a midterm, whereas some of the voters that are trending to the left, like suburbanites, are going to be voting more. So I expect these more right trending states to kind of not have that too much for this cycle. Now moving on to New York, Kathy Hochul is up for re-election, and she's actually kind of locked in. She started off as extremely unpopular, and she's just over the course of her governorship kind of been putting in more effort and been operating as a better candidate. And she's actually becoming more and more approved, and that has been reflected on her election prospects. Mike Lawler, who was originally expecting to run for the seat, has actually kind of seemed like he is going to run instead for re-election in his House race. And Kathy Hochul has been polling very, very, very well in her race against Elise Stefanik, which is what the matchup looks like it's going to be. And I expect her to win re-election by a solid 9 to maybe 10 points, which is a massive improvement from where she was just a few months ago, mainly just because, one, she's getting more popular, and two, she's going against Elise Stefanik and not Mike Lawler. However, if Mike Lawler was the Republican nominee here, then I think it's around like D+7 to maybe D+6 on a bad night for Kathy Hochul. But still, she's winning by a pretty decent margin, especially for what we expected her re-election to look like in 2026. Next, we got Rhode Island. The incumbent governor is actually super disapproved of. I think it's because like a bridge or something. His name's like McNee or like McKee or something. But he is hated. Like only 24% of the state approves of him, according to like a recent poll. Like 2/3 of the state just hates him. So you might look at that and be like, well, hold on now, polarization can only get you so far, Maybe this could be competitive, but hold your horses. He might be primaried. In fact, that's what it looks like it's going to be. Because how are you going to win a primary if you barely won last cycle and you become way, 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 way more unpopular since last time? So yes, I think if he did win the primary somehow, then I do think he'd maybe go down for re-election, but I do think he gets primaried. Leading to a Democrat who's like not completely disapproved of becoming the nominee and then winning the seat by around like 14 to maybe even 15 points. But yes, if he did win the primary, then it could be competitive, but I don't think that's going to happen because he's already hated. How's he going to win the primary? Then we got Maine. It looks like Troy Jackson is going to be the nominee here. It originally looked like it was going to be Jared Golden, but now it looks like he's more angling towards running for re-election in his House seat. Troy Jackson probably is going to win by a bit less than it looked like Jared Golden would have, but still, he's still a pretty good candidate. He's from Maine second, which is good for him. You get to appeal to those more rural voters, and I think he'll win by a pretty strong margin of around maybe 10 to 11 points, which is big for a Maine Democrat. Then we got Pennsylvania. Josh Shapiro is absolutely beloved in his state. He has like a 60% approval rating, and the Republican bench is actually pretty good in Pennsylvania. It looks like Stacey Garrity is going to be the nominee here because Dan Muser, who looked like the front runner, kind of said he wasn't going to be running for this. And she is a very good candidate, but Josh Shapiro is simply just too loved, and I think he will win re-election by a solid 8 to 10 points, setting up possibly a presidential run. Now, if it isn't Stacey Garrity and it is someone like who's not as good as her, then I do think it could go to even safer territory, maybe even too safe, where it's around like D+15. We'll just have to see, but I assume it's going to be Stacey Garrity, and I think she will lose by around 8 to 10 points. And that goes to show how strong Josh Shapiro is, since Stacey Garrity is a very, very, very strong candidate. She won by, I think, likely or like almost likely in 2024, and yet he'd still be beating her by 8 to 10. And the final two likely races for Democrats here are coincidentally the two races that are going to be up in 2025, starting off with the state of Virginia. Abigail Spanberger is running in this race. Glenn Youngkin is the current incumbent governor who's pretty popular, but he is term limited, and the Republicans are instead running Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears, who is horrible. She's been saying some crazy stuff about like gay marriage, and apparently it came out that like she doesn't like her lieutenant governor or her attorney general, I forget which, because he's gay. It's just a whole mess. She's polling super far down, and Abigail Spanberger is a great candidate for Virginia. She won her competitive House race multiple times because she was able to appeal to moderate Republican suburbanites. And that is exactly how you win as a Democrat in Virginia, especially by large margins, by converting moderate Republicans to vote for you. And that is especially easy when your opponent is Winsome Sears. Winston Peters is running a terrible campaign. Abigail Spanberger is absolutely cooking. You can even see that in the fundraising numbers. It's just over for Winston Peters. I think Spanberger is going to win by around 10. And then you've got New Jersey. Mickey Sherrill won the Democratic primary, and she ran a pretty weak Democratic primary campaign, but she still won in the end, and she is going against Jack Ciattarelli, who is the Republican nominee, and it could be pretty close. I mean, Jack Ciattarelli only lost by around 3 in 2021, and he's actually secured a lot more endorsements than he did back then. Republicans are paying a lot more attention to this race than he did then, and that puts him in a better spot, and New Jersey has treaded to the right more than it was in 2021. But still, Mickey Sherrill is a better candidate than who he was against in 2021. And a lot of the rightward trends that we saw in New Jersey, like how I talked about for Illinois and New York, a lot of them are fueled by more minority shifts. And since they are a lower propensity voting bloc, that is hard to really take advantage of as a Republican in a midterm year, especially without Trump on the ballot. And since suburbanites are going to be the main ones turning out more for this race, and since they are trending to the left, or at least being stagnant, that really plays into Mickey Sherrill's hands, and I think in the end, she's probably going to win by around 5. I expected Democrat overperformance in both these races, since we saw a pretty decent Democrat overperformance in basically all of the off-year races we saw this year, and I think that will continue here, especially in Virginia, but lesser so in New Jersey, and I think that's barely enough for me to put New Jersey at above a lean margin, just barely at likely, but I could see it going to lean. We'll just have to see. Now for the likely Republican races, we're starting off with Oklahoma. I know this is one that you expected to be safe, but hear me out. So a lot like Oregon, Oklahoma tends to be more Democratic in governor races, and that's largely because, like Oregon, again, like a mirror image of Oregon, the Republican governors in Oklahoma have tended to be pretty unpopular, and that's the case with Kevin Stitt, who is the incumbent Oklahoma governor, who is term limited, but he is very much hated due to a lot of the stuff he's like passed and said as governor. And proof of that is that he also only won by likely in 2022, which was a red year. So you've got the historical precedent, but what's it looking like candidate-wise? Well, in the Republican primary, it looks like a pretty open field, but there is a worst case scenario for Oklahoma Republicans with Ryan Walters, who is the state superintendent, who is very controversial and very unpopular, who could win the nomination. I don't think he will right now, but he's polling in like second place, it looks like, and still the threat there of him being the nominee and making it close to competitive, like R+8, is always there, especially since it looks like he's leaning towards a run for governor, and that makes me keep it at just below the safe margin. And if Oklahoma Republicans do nominate someone more normal and more electable, Oklahoma Democrats could still nominate someone great and still bring it down to under 15 points. We'll just have to see, but I'm going to keep it at around R+13 to 14, but depending on who the nominees are, then it could super easily move up to safe, because again, it's Oklahoma. But a lot of special circumstances lead to me keeping it at likely Republican. Now moving over to Texas, you have Greg Abbott, who is a pretty popular incumbent governor, especially since Texas is now trending to the right, which is crazy for me to say, but it's the case. Latinos are trending to the right super fast, and suburban trends are not really enough to make up for that. In fact, a lot of suburbanites voted for Trump when they voted for Biden in 2020, especially in like Houston and Austin and Dallas. It's just a very big mess for Texas Democrats, and they don't even really have a nominee here. There's like a farmer that I saw launch this campaign. I don't know how well he's going to do. I saw a lot of the top Texas Democrats like met up and decided who's going to run for what. So we'll just have to see who ends up running for this. But in the end, it's Texas. Come on. Like, it's not even trending to the left anymore. And it was already like R+12 in 2022. It's just like Jover for Texas Democrats. R+10. And now moving over to Kansas, you have Laura Kelly, who is the incumbent Democrat, who is actually term limited, so she cannot run for re-election. And the Kansas Democrats have kind of a bench. They have the lieutenant governor, and they have Sharice Davids. But I really don't think Sharice Davids would risk like retiring from her likely Democratic House race. And I don't think the lieutenant governor could really get it too close. Although, I mean, it depends on who the Kansas Republicans could nominate. They have some very, very, very bad options, but they also have some standard options that would win by a likely margin. I'm going to keep it at around like R+8, just because I could see the incumbent Democratic lieutenant governor running for this. And since you have incumbency on their side, it could be somewhat competitive, but I don't really think it gets that close. So I'm going to keep it at around likely R, like around like R+8. Now moving over to South Carolina, I believe Joe Cunningham is term limited. I'm not sure. Nancy Mace might run for this, which that's crazy. If she does, I don't think she can win the primary, and that sucks for South Carolina Democrats because that's basically their only hope of making this race somewhat competitive. But in the end, it's South Carolina. It's a likely R state through and through. It was even safe in 2024, so I'm going to mark it as likely R at around like R plus 13 to 14. And then we got Florida. Florida. It is trending Republican so fast, especially like Miami. It's just over for Florida Democrats. We don't even know who they'd run here. They just have no bench anymore. They have no good candidates. They're just kind of cooked. And they don't even have Matt Gaetz to save them since he's not running for this race, most likely. So yeah, they're just cooked. Florida's trending to the right super fast. It could even be safe. It looks like the Republican nominee is going to be Byron Donalds, who's pretty good as a candidate, I guess. Although it looks like Casey DeSantis might try and, challenge him in the primary, which could be pretty interesting to watch. But in the end, I think Byron Donalds is going to win. And I think he's going to win the general election by a pretty solid margin of around 12 to 13 points. Although, since Florida Republicans tend to outperform always by a massive margin, it could even be safe. I wouldn't even be that surprised. Now moving over to Nevada, you have Joe Lombardo, who is the incumbent Republican governor who is running for re-election. He is utterly beloved in the state. In fact, most somewhat moderate Republican governors in Nevada are absolutely loved. If you need any more evidence, look at that 2014 Nevada governor's race. Jesus Christ. Yeah, so he's loved. He's like the reverse Josh Shapiro, sort of, where he's beloved. And also like Josh Shapiro, the Democrats are running a very good candidate against him. Aaron Ford, who is the, I believe, state treasurer. He's a very good candidate. He's an overperformer, but I just don't really think he can get it to lean just because Joe Lombardo is that well liked in the state. Although I don't think he'll win by enough to cause some massive down ballot effects for Nevada Republicans. I just think he'll win by a pretty solid margin of around 6 to 7 points. But I think a lot of the Democrats that do vote for him will ticket split. But I do think he wins every single county and win by a pretty solid margin. And the final likely state that I have for Republicans is the state of New Hampshire. You have Kelly Ayotte, who is very well liked in New Hampshire. They love their incumbent Republican governors. Just look at Chris Sununu, who won by a massive margin in 2020 and 2022 and 2018. Yeah. And they love Kelly Ayotte. I do not think she'll win by as much of a margin as Chris Sununu, mainly because, one, it's a bluer year, and two, people have gotten more polarized, and New Hampshire is, in the end, a likely D state. She's no Phil Scott, but I do still think she'll win by a pretty solid margin. I don't really think Democrats try and invest too much in here and try and push a really good candidate. So I'm going to keep it at around R plus 9 to R plus 8, although it could even be double digits since she won by a massive margin in 2024 when Democrats were actually trying to challenge her. All right, now for the lean Democratic races, we're starting off with the state of Wisconsin. The incumbent governor, Tony Evers, might run for re-election. He might not. It's looking kind of 50-50. He seems to be kind of angling himself for no, given some of the stuff he's been saying recently that have been kind of nuts, I will say. But he still might. Either way, I still think it'll be pretty similar of a race where, Republicans are kind of falling apart in Wisconsin. It's trending left as a state. That's been made evident as of recently. And Tony Evers already won by 3 in 2022, which was a red year. And that was largely because Tim Michaels was a horrible candidate, but it was still an R plus 2 to R plus 3 year. And Tony Evers won by a pretty solid margin. I think Republicans could run Eric Hovde, but I don't really see it, especially since he just lost. I think he might go for Senate in 2028 instead, but it's still possible. We'll just have to see what happens there. But either way, I still think it's around a D plus 3 to D plus 4 race because it kind of balances out where I think the national environment will be bluer, but Republicans will be running a better candidate. So they kind of balance out. And in the end, Democrats end up winning by the same margin they did in 2022. If Tony Evers does not run for re-election, Democrats have some options. They have Ben Wilker, who was the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, who was a great party leader. They have some other candidates, Sarah Godlewski or something. I think that's her name. Although I think she'll run for Senate in 2028 instead. Although she could run here. Democrats just have a bench here. Republicans kind of do, but Democrats just have the edge here with the environment, incumbency possibly if Tony Evers does run. And just Wisconsin is turning into more and more of a leaning blue state. So all of that to say, I'm thinking around D plus 3 to 4, around D plus 3.5. Next up, we got Michigan. The incumbent governor, Gretchen Whitmer, is term limited. It looks like it's actually going to be a three-way matchup between Hillary Scholten, John James, and Mike Duggan, who's running as an independent. And if you don't know who he is, he's the mayor of Detroit, who's actually very popular. So you might look at that and be like, oh, he's the mayor of Detroit. Democrats need Detroit to win in Michigan. And how are they going to do that if he's splitting the vote? He's going to be a big spoiler, and John James is going to win by a pretty solid margin. But that's actually not what the polling is showing. It actually seems like he's polling from a pretty even amount. Obviously, slightly leaning towards, polling more from Scholten, but it seems like he is actually taking some John James voters, and he's actually polling pretty decently, in a somewhat close third place. Still, obviously behind the two major parties, but still, not too distant, which is pretty surprising. I do think his campaign will kind of lose some momentum as time goes on if he doesn't just drop out. But the main reason why I don't think he's acting like too much of a spoiler against Hillary Scholten is that he actually is, I think, appealing a lot to the more working class Trump voters in a place like Macomb County, which is right outside of Detroit and more working class. And I think they'd be more open to supporting someone like him who's running a more moderate kind of campaign where they could vote for him instead of for John James. And I know these are the people that brought Michigan from a likely Democratic state all the way to the toss-up state that we see today. And if they go for Mike Duggan instead of John James, that could kind of offset a lot of the Democratic voters that were going to vote for Hillary Scholten, but instead are voting for Mike Duggan. So in conclusion, while I do think Mike Duggan is taking away more voters from Hillary Scholten than he is from John James, I do think it's not enough to where John James should be considered the favorite for now. And that's what polling is showing. Granted, Michigan polling has always been pretty shaky, but I do kind of tend to believe it here because there is some reasoning to back it up. So right now I have it at around Scholten plus 2.5 to 3. If Mike Duggan does drop out, it goes to likely Democratic. If he does seem like he's polling more and more from Hillary Scholten than John James, it goes to tilt, or maybe even tilt or lean Republican. But for now, I'm going to have it at lean Democratic around D plus 2 to D plus 2.5. And the final lean state that I have for Democrats is the state of Arizona. This is a weird one because it actually looked like Katie Hobbs was going to go down for the longest time. She is, or at least seemed, pretty unpopular, and it looked like Republicans were finally going to get their acts together. Trump actually endorsed a pretty good candidate in the primary, and then things just kind of fell apart for the Arizona GOP. It now looks like Katie Hobbs is actually polling pretty decently, both in the general election and just approval rating wise. And approval rating wise. And the Republican primary for governor has just been falling apart. The good Republican candidate ended up losing her Trump endorsement, and he actually dual endorsed her and Andy Biggs, who looks like the new, very strong frontrunner for the Republican primary. And he's the former chair of the House Freedom Caucus. He's just a terrible candidate for the suburbs, and I don't think he would do too well in a general election against Katie Hobbs, which, if you're the Arizona GOP, this one's got to sting, because every single time you have a competitive race that might look like it's going to go your way, you just nominate someone horrible, and the Democrats end up winning. For the last decade, almost every single Democratic win in Arizona has been because the Republicans nominated someone who was unelectable, and it looks like that streak's going to continue again. As I've learned, Arizonans like Donald Trump, but they don't like people who sound like Donald Trump, and that is someone who Andy Biggs is, and he's just not really too palatable for Arizona. And make no mistake, Katie Hobbs isn't doing herself any favors. She is vetoing the craziest bills. She vetoed a bill to make vote counting faster. The way she did that, it doesn't look good to voters. She isn't really doing herself any favors, unlike Kathy Hochul, for instance, where she actually did lock in and is looking like more and more of a better candidate. It's not really due to Katie Hobbs being any better. It's just more because Republicans nominated someone who's just not a very good candidate. And I think Andy Biggs will lose by around 1 point. A lot of Arizona Democrats tend to overperform in midterm years. You saw that with Mark Kelly. You saw that with Katie Hobbs herself. And I think you will see that again in 2026, where Katie Hobbs wins by a slightly larger margin than expected of around lean Democratic, or Hobbs plus 1. And that is it for the lean Democratic states. Now moving on to the lean Republican states, or the states that I think will go to Republicans by between 5 and 1%. Starting off with the state of Ohio. Now, Ohio is a very interesting state. You got suburbs, you got populous areas, you got rural areas, you got cities. It's a very populous state. It's a very important state. It's a state that used to be a swing state and has trended very Republican in the past. but it looks like that might kind of be receding a bit, at least for 2026, because, well, the Republican nominee. So Vivek Ramaswamy looks like he's going to be the Republican nominee for governor, and he's just not a very good candidate. I do think a lot of Vivek hate is more online. People who think he's completely unelectable and going to lose in 2026. I think people are kind of reading too much into that. It's still Ohio at the end of the day, and things are becoming more and more polarized. So I think he's still going to win by around like 3 to maybe 4. But a lot of that depends on who the Democratic nominee is. I think that 3 to 4 margin is if Democrats nominate someone really good. It looks like Sherrod Brown might run for this. It looks like Tim Ryan might run for this. If I had to bet on someone, I'd say Sherrod Brown is probably going to run for this. I think Tim Ryan would be a bit better because Sherrod Brown has lost his incumbency, and that's a big factor. And I think Tim Ryan would be better at winning the suburbs since he's more moderate than Sherrod Brown. But in the end, I think both of them would lose by a pretty similar margin of around 3 to 4 points, just because at the end of the day, it's Ohio. It's a Trump plus 12 state. And I don't really see Democrats making that up unless there's like a blue wave. And I think in a best case scenario, the state does flip blue. But I think for now it's around R plus 3 to 4, assuming that the Democratic nominee is someone really good like Tim Ryan or like Sherrod Brown, which I think it probably will be. And the next lean Republican state that I have is the state of Iowa. Kim Reynolds, who's the incumbent Republican governor, announced she will not be running for re-election, which was a massive blow to Iowa Democrats because she is hated. I think she's the most hated governor in the entire country. And the Democrats actually have a very good candidate lined up. Rob Sand is the last statewide Democrat left in Iowa. He's the state auditor, and he is a very good candidate. He's running a very good campaign. He's getting very good fundraising numbers. He got like $1 million in a day or something. But kind of similar to Ohio, like at the end of the day, it's still a Trump plus 13 state. And since polarization is getting bigger, although I think there will be a pretty blue year in Iowa in 2026, probably bluer than the rest of the country, I still don't think it's enough for Rob Sand, at least for now. He could win, especially depending on who the Republican nominee is going to be. It looks like Zach Nunn might run for this, which could be pretty interesting since he's a decent candidate, at least in his district. But we'll just have to see how things shake out. Much like Ohio, I think in a blue wave, it could go blue. But for now, I'm going to keep it as lean Republican or around R plus 3 to R plus 4, maybe even inching towards like R plus 5. But I'm going to keep it at around R plus 4 for now. And the final lean Republican state is, which one's going to be, Alaska or Georgia? Alaska or Georgia? It's Georgia, actually. I know that seems shocking, like Alaska, it's right there. It's a Trump plus 13 state. Hear me out, okay? Georgia, it's just been a mess for Democrats. They had 2 very good candidates lined up in Jason Carter or Lucy McBath. But due to extremely unfortunate circumstances where both of them had family members who had cancer, which is deeply unfortunate, and I wish both of their family members a speedy recovery. Due to that, though, Democrats lost their 2 very good candidates due to just circumstances that no one could really control, unfortunately. And now they have horrible candidates lined up. They have Stacey Abrams. They have Keisha Lance Bottoms, the former mayor of Atlanta, who is hated. Their only decent candidate is Jason Esteves, but I don't really think he'd win the primary. And even if he did, I don't even think he'd be the favorite, even in a blue year like this. I think he could bring it down to tilt, but I don't think he could even really make it blue, at least right now. At the end of the day, Georgia is a more red state on the state level, and I do think come like 2030, it could flip blue as the state trends more and more to the left. But for now, due to seriously unfortunate events, Democrats just not having good candidates lined up, and it looks like it's going to be probably, if I had to bet, Keisha Lance Bottoms, I think like R plus 3 to R plus 4. I don't really know who the Republican nominee is going to be. They're all kind of the same to me, to be honest. But either way, I think it's around like R plus 3 to 4. If it is Stacey Abrams, I honestly don't know if she'd perform better or worse than Keisha Lance Bottoms. They're both terrible. If it is Jason Esteves, though, then it goes to around tilt Republican. Now, there has been some talk of a former Republican lieutenant governor for Georgia running as a Democrat, and I just want to share my thoughts on that here. It could work for the suburbs. They used to be super Republican back before Trump, and I think he could seriously appeal to them since they used to vote for him anyway. But the issue is with Metro Atlanta, when you've got a former Republican lieutenant governor, I don't really think black voters would really vote for him. And minority turnout is a massive issue in Georgia come 2026. So I don't really think he'd even be the favorite. And the final state left on the board is Alaska. I'm gonna not select either party for now because I just want to talk about the state's political landscape before we dive into which party I think is gonna win. Now, Alaska is a very different state from the rest of the country. It's a state that is more bipartisan. Democrats control at least one of the two legislatures, might even be both of them. I honestly kind of forgot, because Republicans are kind of caucusing with Democrats. It's a very weird system. They're a very bipartisan state where it's one of the last bastions of split ticket voting. You know, they elected Mary Peltola to a federal office in 2022 and almost reelected her in 2024. And in terms of its political geography, it's a more blue state in the rurals and in the inner city, whereas Republicans have their main voter strongholds in the suburbs of Anchorage, kind of similar to what you might see in, for example, Wisconsin before Trump. But much like what you saw in Wisconsin, that's kind of turning around, where Republicans are gaining a lot in the more rural areas, while Democrats are making huge advances in the suburbs. And that makes the state trend left slightly year by year. And then you saw in 2022, Mary Peltola did very well and almost won re-election here in 2024, but Trump was on the ballot and he won by 13 in this state, so there just wasn't enough ticket splitting to go around. But 2026 could be different. If I had to bet money, I'd say Mary Peltola does go for this race, and she is, needless to say, a very good candidate. And even without incumbency, I still think she would do very well. You might say, well, she lost by 3 in 2024. Let me tell you some key differences here. First of all, Trump's not on the ballot. So a lot of these Republicans that just turn out to vote for Trump and vote straight Republican down ballot aren't going to be turning out. Second of all, it's a governor race, so it's less polarized. You know, people are more likely to vote for someone of the opposite party in a governor's race than, you know, for example, a Senate race. You can see that in Iowa, in Ohio, in Oklahoma, in Kansas, and I think you'll see that here in Alaska. Also, Alaska has a history of voting for Democrats and independents for governor and for Senate, and I think they could do it in 2026 if Mary Peltola is the nominee and if Republicans don't nominate someone too good. But the issue for Democrats is that's just too many variables. Mary Peltola might not run. Republicans might select someone who is very good. We just don't really know. And because there's just too many variables about it, you know, you'd have to have Mary Peltola run. You'd have to have Republicans nominate someone who's not, you know, a pretty good candidate. I'm going to have it cautiously at tilt Republican. So I think it'll go to Republicans by less than 1 point. However, if Mary Peltola does announce, I think that'll swing the scales just enough to make it tilt Democratic. But for now, I'm going to keep it as tilt Republican. I know it's one of my hot takes that I think this race will be very, very, very close and not just a slam dunk for Republicans, or at least lean R. But I think Mary Peltola does run. I'm not 100%, which is why I don't have it as tilt Democrat. But if she does run, I think I'll move it there. But yeah, if she doesn't run, I think it goes to lean Republican, maybe even likely. But for now, I'm going to keep it at tilt Republican. And with that, we have the finalized governor map for 2025 and 2026. There is one flip, with Democrats flipping Virginia. Democrats defended very competitive seats in Arizona, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, while Republicans defended seats in Iowa, in Ohio, in Georgia, in Alaska. And yeah, that's how I think the map shakes out. One seat changes hands in Virginia. I don't know how it affects the overall governor's map. I don't know how you factor in the other states that aren't up for re-election here. But Republicans won 19 races. Democrats won 19 races. And overall, I think the national environment is around like D plus 4 to 5, just as like a baseline reference here. But yeah, that's my final map. If you have any suggestions on what the next video should be, or any comments or any predictions on what could happen here, maybe something that I missed, let me know down in the comment section. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good day. See ya.